Te oigo.
Good morning, Peter. Good to see you. And I think we're broadcast live, but we'll get started in about 2 minutes.
Perfect.
But we're live right now. I have a short outline I'll put up and sort of ask the two of you questions to respond throughout.
Sure.
Sounds great. Hey.
And I can see some friends in the audience. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just about 1 minute.
Keep my fingers crossed for cats in the background.
Where are they? Where are they? They've been very interested. We now have some ducks out on the creek, and they are very, very interested in ducks.
I can imagine.
They're learning ducks.
Hi all, thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just 1 minute.
That's a nice logo.
Well, it's all Will's good work.
I love that one.
All the noun projects, good work. But yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation today. Just as a reminder to anyone who is watching on Facebook Live, I would encourage you to come over and join the Zoom meeting so that you can participate in the Q&A session. We will have some time reserved at the end for questions, and we'll be taking those through the Q&A functionality in Zoom. So if you're able to shift over and join us on the Zoom meeting, I would encourage you all to do that. At this moment, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank Charisma and the organizers of the Global Congress for putting together this COVID-focused remote Congress on very short notice. Thank you for all your hard work. And thank you to the translators who are on the session today and who are making this accessible to more people. So it's really an interesting opportunity to reach people in a way that we can't always in person. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Peter Yazzie at American University Washington College of Law, and Will Cross from the NC State University Libraries. We'll be talking about our work this spring, investigating the ways that copyright limitations and exceptions can enable emergency online education going forward more broadly, and in more specific terms, how fair use and the best practices in fair use can enable the creation of more complete and useful open educational resources. So what we're going to cover first are the restrictions, both real and imagined, that people felt were imposed by copyright in the emergency shift to online teaching. A lot of our work here got started basically as a frustrated response to all of the back and forth on Twitter with imagined horrible consequences for teachers doing the regular work of teaching in the transition to emergency online learning. So there are all of these very, sometimes very well-intentioned, but deeply scary responses on Twitter saying, well, you can't read that picture book over Zoom. You know, you do that, and the next thing you know, they're going to be pounding on your door and demanding payment. And so there were all of these moments where the regular routines of what teachers had accepted as their in-classroom practice were disrupted in this emergency transition. And it brought to the surface all these questions about copyright. And we saw that physical copies and people's sort of settled understanding about what they could do with a physical copy were disrupted. And in the digital world, licenses were often inflexible, so it didn't meet the needs of the situation and couldn't be altered. They were just completely unavailable, or to the extent that a pre-pandemic licensing structure existed, it was often in a one-to-one retail model and was completely cost prohibitive for groups trying to meet the needs of an entire school district or university. And so we dove in and we looked at the ways in which fair use and other limitations and exceptions to copyright could build resilience and flexibility in this moment. But as we did so, we discovered something that, at least to me, was not obvious, which is that there were really very few cases where you could rely on fair use, but only in this emergency. That what we found, in fact, were that the principles about access to educational materials and the analysis of whether or not the thing you were doing was transformative enough to be fair use actually projected forward in most situations. There were a few exceptions around the periphery related, I think, primarily to scanning and distributing textbooks in short-term disruptions of access. But the core questions about transforming classroom practices to online teaching, we realized were not particularly pandemic specific. And in sort of partnership to that, I think the work that we have been doing with the OER community highlighted the ways in which materials that were open educational resources, that were created by, owned by, controlled by, and delivered by teachers and school systems, had an adaptability and a resilience that could not be matched by paid licensed educational materials. That school districts had to face challenges of getting materials to every student, and that the flexibility that you needed to do that in different situations, different physical locations, just different household circumstances, were not something that commercial publishers had really thought about or invested in. So we turned, I think, our work finally to how to create stronger, more useful, more comprehensive open educational resources. And in that work, what we realized is that questions about fair use and the ability to incorporate third-party materials were really limiting the ability of open educational resources to compete head-to-head with traditional all rights reserved published materials. So we're going to talk through a little bit of each of these more. And the first thing I wanted to talk through with you, Will, was what some of the experiences that you had in your work at the library, and then also that you experienced when we were talking to K-12 people about what barriers had been thrown up immediately in that emergency transition to taking what had been classroom practices and extending them online.
Absolutely. Thanks, Meredith. So I think you hit the nail on the head. The number one barrier was often misinformation, was often a sense of paralysis and fear and, oh my gosh, what are we going to do in this situation? We can't do anything because it's always too risky and scary. And different institutions think about that in different ways, of course. This is a hobby horse I get on a lot is the fact that there are well-to-do institutions that can afford to have you or me or Peter, or I see Lisa in the chat, right, can have legal expertise to say, like, it's okay. This is what fair use was built for. This is the moment we've been preparing for, in a sense. But the institutions that often had the greatest need were also the institutions that didn't have access to that copyright information and to that tailored guidance. So one of the most valuable things that I think came out early on was that public statement on fair use for emergency and remote teaching. That was just a large group of copyright interested and expert folks came together and said, here's how we think through the issues, particularly in this moment of crisis. The number of people who engaged with that and said, okay, this is really empowering for me. That was really, really significant. Another barrier that I saw quite often is something that I know you and I and others have seen working with open education as well, which is often the barriers were technical. There was a sense that, well, last year, the idea of doing some sort of inclusive access locked into a for-profit, locked down site made a ton of sense. But when our students' only access to Wi-Fi is like once a day they drive to the Target parking lot and set up shop, that's a really bad way to do teaching and learning, right? So those two barriers, the sense of I'm afraid or uncertain about copyright, or just technically it's not possible for me to engage with these materials, those two barriers were really, really major sort of first order problems that needed to be addressed.
Thanks, Will. And I know one of the questions we got at the very beginning were questions that had to do with format shifting, basically, that a teacher, for example, would feel very comfortable reading a storybook out loud to her class, right? There was no, teachers do not worry that they need a public performance license to read a storybook to the students seated on the carpet squares in their room. But as this emergency transition to online teaching happened, we saw suddenly this worry that in the digital world, everything was different. Can you talk us through a little bit the different digital scenarios there of that reading aloud example and how they sort of break down under a fair use analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a nice example. I don't know how many teachers have ever said the phrase Section 110.1's face-to-face teaching exception. It was often about a sort of an intuition or a gut feeling rather than that they had like scrupulously studied the law in different ways. The good news there is that those exceptions, Section 110.1 and then 110.2, the Teach Act and on, they point to this sort of center of gravity that fair use often sort of embodies in a different way, right? We know that the law makes clear and Congress has made it clear that teachers doing, in the moment in a classroom, physical or digital, teaching by showing an example, by playing some of a song or a full song, etc. That's the sort of thing they're supposed to be doing because there's a public policy for that and because it's often transformative as well. So the fair use analysis is often about taking that intuition and saying your intuition is still right, even if it feels different in this context, right? The purpose here is very different. The original story existed for X, to sell the book or to present information, et cetera. So it's transformative and it is sort of in line with copyright's values when you're doing the teaching and learning. The amount is appropriate for all the reasons the amount is appropriate in the physical space as well. So often it's a matter of just sort of talking through whether it's the 4 factors or the sort of transformation analysis where we tend to center our work and saying like, this is the values that are correct, the practices that make good teaching, those should still be your touchstones. And here's how to think through the legal context there, but go back to those first principles. And that's often the way, at least I talk about it with folks.
Thanks, Will. And I think one of the things that struck me in that situation was very often when we were working with school districts or with teachers to explain this fair use analysis, there was a question of, okay, so I understand that it's fair use in my classroom, but then is it only fair use if I do it on a closed Zoom webinar or a private Facebook channel or a public Facebook but unlisted channel, right? There are all these sort of degrees of targeted only to the students who would otherwise be sitting in your classroom to some slightly larger group. And Peter, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about some broad questions about equity and access, but maybe we would start here. And I think we came to the conclusion that it is almost certainly fair use to use Zoom or another closed platform to digitally do what you would have done in your closed classroom. And that the questions are significantly harder to answer at the other end of the spectrum, where you have just decided that you're a teacher and you like storybooks, and so you're going to have a public monetized YouTube channel where you just read storybooks you like. That is not at all a sort of easy case for fair use. We're pretty skeptical of that. But there's this big spectrum in between. And I think we saw this tension between the security of using closed platforms or closed tools and the reality about what that means for equitable access for different types of students and differently situated students. Could you talk a little bit about whether or not there's a rigid rule there or whether you can take more flexible analysis?
I can with pleasure, and thank you, Meredith. And in beginning, I wanted to say something about equity access or issues of equity and access generally. And that is something very simple, but at least to me, very important. And that is that the circumstances of the pandemic emergency have highlighted in ways that all of us understand the equity access issues in education. We are constantly and appropriately being reminded of the needs of students with technical or technically identified disabilities, as well as those of all of the students who labor under or who encounter barriers to learning which don't constitute disabilities, say, within the meaning of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but can nevertheless be profound. Difficulties in language, difficulties in the availability of appropriate learning settings within the home, difficulties of many kinds that really grow out of, more than anything else, disparities in income and privilege. And so when we talk about how to think through the rules of copyright law as they enable access, we should be aware, I think, that although a few of the difficulties that we've been encountering during the pandemic emergency will eventually go away as that emergency ends, others will not. Many of the other issues of equity and access predated the pandemic and will persist beyond it. So the way we think about what teachers can do to use technology, to use new means abetted and supported by doctrines like fair use, isn't only a topic of importance in the current months and the months to come. It is, I think, a topic of enduring importance. And I just wanted to stress that. Now to your specific question, it's a balancing act, right? In other words, if I am a teacher working in a virtual classroom, the easiest way, perhaps, to make at least some of the material that I want my students to have available is to put it on a public platform and simply tell them how to find it using any device or any appropriate technology to which they have access. But on the other hand, that approach is in some tension with an important theme in copyright law, which is that those who engage in fair use ought to do reasonable and appropriate things to make sure that the material that they are offering for a particular purpose isn't diverted or sort of glommed for another purpose. It's not that you can get into legal trouble for that yourself. It's not that a teacher who offers a lesson online that includes a copyrighted object that somehow finds its way into the hands of a commercial pirate will himself or herself, that is the teacher, be liable for those downstream events. It is that the reasonable care that a teacher or an institution or a school system invest in trying to limit the distribution of learning materials to students may affect the core analysis of whether they are engaged in fair use in the first instance. So the question then becomes, what is a reasonable level of precaution given the needs of your students? So this might work itself out very differently in different environments. If I can be confident that all of my students have both the hardware and the constant, more or less constant hot and cold running broadband access to do everything on Zoom, that's great. But if, on the other hand, I know that many of my students are going to be relying on other platforms, YouTube, for example, then probably what it makes sense for me to do with my content is to put it on a dedicated YouTube channel rather than offering it simply to the world at large, and point my students toward that dedicated channel. It's not that others couldn't find it, but it is directed primarily and is likely to be found and used primarily by those for whom it was intended. There are no laws about this. There are no rules about this. There are no cases that tell us exactly what to do except to behave reasonably. And reasonably means not hyperprotectively bearing in mind only the needs, or perhaps I should more accurately say the desires of content owners. Reasonably means, especially for a teacher or an educational institution, taking into account the real needs, the real challenges to access that your population of learners faces. So that isn't a carte blanche. That isn't to say you can do anything. It is to say, like everything else involving fair use, you ought to think through what you're doing and be prepared, if challenged, to explain to someone why you think you made a good choice. It does mean that you have a good deal of latitude as a well-intentioned, good faith educational actor in tailoring the level of, let's say, for lack of a better word, safeguards to your learning population.
Thank you. And I think that was one of the areas that I thought was most important for us to focus on early on, was that to make sure that tailoring, not to stress that metaphor, but to make sure that when you tailor that the areas where it is too tight or where it sort of pinches are not the ones that differentially disadvantage students who are already marginalized.
Exactly. And if I could add one further thought, the publishers didn't make this easy, because when the nature of the emergency became clear, when issues like reading aloud became front and center, the publishers said, well, all right, we see the problem. We're not selling any books anyway, so we will allow you on certain terms and conditions to read books aloud to your own students online. We will allow you, in other words, to do things that you already, if you only knew, have the right to do, but only on the following conditions. And then there was a long list of things you had to do, including yanking the material offline immediately after it had been placed there. And my favorite was the one where, when you started to read a storybook to your class, you had to, or maybe even when you started to read any chapter of a storybook to your class, assuming you were reading it over several days, you had to formally acknowledge the author and the publisher by courtesy of whom this story was being brought to the classroom. I mean, it was silly, but it was confusing, because when you read all of that, you could have imagined that those publishers actually had a legal basis to stand on in imposing those conditions on an otherwise self-evidently fair educational use. They didn't, but their pretense added significantly to the uncertainty that teachers and institutions felt and feel, I'm sure, about this issue of safeguards.
Thank you. And I think, Peter, you have said earlier that teachers can feel, very sort of stuck when they're trying to figure out how to do their work of their teaching in the face of these pretty aggressive rules that are implied by these publisher demands. And I think one of the areas where that conflict is really highlighted is, in the United States, both legally and also ethically, there is an obligation to provide students with disabilities to equal access to public education. And that is, in fact, a legal obligation. It is also, I think, as you mentioned, for students who may not have a diagnosed disability, but still need flexibility and accommodation, there's a ethical obligation. And so I think one of the things we've seen in this situation and also in others is that in the shift to digital teaching and learning, this worry about downstream use, this worry that someone might come in and pluck something out of the teaching context for an inappropriate use has pushed people to make those materials less useful and therefore presumably less attractive for that reuse. And that could include taking content in a narrative document where they wanted to take an excerpt of the text, but were worried a little bit. And so as sort of a safety measure, took a screenshot of the excerpt of that text. Or I think broadly, there are many digital rights management tools where you could view a PDF in the window, but you can't download it. Or you can only watch something if you're logged in through a specific portal.
Or linking. What about linking?
Or linking instead of taking text and including it directly. Or instead of taking something and actually transforming it from an inaccessible format to an accessible one.
Exactly.
In the US, is the law clear about whether or not transforming materials, storing materials, distributing materials provide disability access? Is it clear whether that is permitted by fair use?
I think it's perfectly clear. And we have this, I think two things are clear, and I want to emphasize them because we both have them on sort of high authority. The first we have on the authority of the no less a tribunal than the Supreme Court, which has told us what I said before and what you've reiterated is a problem, that if you're a good faith fair user or otherwise qualifies as such, you just don't have to worry about legal liability for downstream bad behavior by others. And we have that. That little insight is one of the few valuable things that came out of the flurry of file sharing cases some time ago. It's in the Grokster decision, and it's a very important proposition. So we have that on high authority, and then on almost as high an authority, where copyright at least is concerned, that is that of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit, which is sort of traditionally the elite court where copyright issues are concerned, in the New York Federal District Court. We have the HathiTrust case, which involves mass digitization of books for a variety of purposes on behalf of, through the activities of a consortium, which consisted of Google on the one hand and a bunch of academic libraries whose collections were being digitized on the other. And one of the things that HathiTrust tells us is that it is a core fair use to transform, digitize, and make available by digital means printed texts for an audience of people with various kinds of vision impairments or physical disabilities that make it difficult or impossible for them to manipulate a codex book. And it couldn't be clearer. I mean, it's right there in the law. Now, it's one case, one set of facts. Applying it to something else, to the practices of an elementary school teacher who knows that there are a significant number of children with both diagnosed and undiagnosed reading issues in her classroom or his classroom, that's obviously an extrapolation. But the principle has been established, and it doesn't take much vision, and it shouldn't take too much courage either to extend that principle to that new but analogous situation. So yeah, I think that principle is well established, and it's a fascinating example, incidentally, of the convergence between copyright policy on the one hand. You know, we've got a copyright law that's based on a constitutional provision that says that the whole point of the copyright scheme is to make information available to citizens. Copyright policy, constitutional copyright policy on the one hand, and the policy of the enormously powerful ADA on the other hand. And here they converge. And that convergence in the HathiTrust case leads to the court's analysis and its conclusion that digitization in order to make analog text available to the visually impaired is a classic core example of fair use.
Thank you. And I think,
can I add a third authority to that?
please.
Okay, so in addition to the authorities that Peter mentioned, I wanted to mention an authority that matters a lot to me, and that's my counsel's office. The way they always think about these issues is, which lawsuit would you rather defend?
Yeah.
Right. That there is the
Good.
angry rights holder comes in and says, how dare you have digitized that material to make it accessible to a print disabled person? Or maybe more recently, how dare you have made that material available to prevent a public health crisis? Well, that's one lawsuit. And the other is, my college-age child has passed away because you didn't do everything you could to protect their safety, or my student who needs access. And I know which lawsuit my counsel would always rather defend.
That's great, Will. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Which lawsuit? But I think also, you know, it brings up this point that
If there ever were such a lawsuit, which is
exactly.
vanishingly unlikely.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that these are questions that are going to be debated within school systems and universities, but also I think they really inform the way that teachers and professors and institutions see their work. That it is really important as we move forward through the current emergency, but also after this focus has passed, to say, what are we doing to best serve the access needs of all students? You know, one group of students that I think has often struggled to get full accommodation and access and education are students with remitting and relapsing health conditions. So students who may not have a sort of traditionally diagnosed disability, but for a period of time, often extended or repeated, are unable to attend school in person. You know, one of the things I think we've seen in this digital transition is that a lot of the justifications that required students in particular, but I think people in general, to be in person, to have the full learning experience, have traditionally excluded people with disabilities from full access or participation. And what we are seeing is, in fact, technologically, those access needs can be met. And I think it's really important that we keep a focus on, as you say, Will, the professional mission and the professional obligation to serve all students. And that if you have to choose between the mission risk of not effectively teaching all of your students, or the sort of pragmatic risk of getting a copyright demand letter that you need to have both of those in mind, that it cannot be that doing nothing to provide access is the safe answer, that we have to say, do you take seriously your obligations to meet the needs of all your students? And therefore, you should engage with the law that clearly says you are in fact empowered to do that. But I think copyright limitations and exceptions are only one part of this puzzle. Often they address access to materials that were not originally teaching materials. So newspaper articles, inclusions, excerpts, quotations, videos. But there is this other real problem, I think, which is that the options in the textbook market itself are really pretty severely limited. And so one of the things I think we've seen here, particularly actually this fall as opposed to this spring, is that as librarians geared up to try to help the teachers and professors they support meet the challenges of teaching digitally, that the options to provide textbooks digitally are really very limited, particularly textbooks that had often been loaned by libraries or purchased as reserved copies. And Will, I know with your library hat on, you've been involved in some of these discussions about what digital options are available to librarians. And can you talk a little bit about the limits there?
Absolutely. So I think you and Peter have talked about the idea that the pandemic has exposed these sort of systematic failings and inequities and unavailabilities. I think exactly the same thing is happening in terms of library access. We've revealed this sort of ongoing problem of a move away from copyright and towards a licensing regime, right? A body of law that has this sort of equitable, promote the progress of science mission to just these pure business decisions that often remove a lot of our rights in that context. I mentioned that public statement on fair use. They specifically call out, there are some rights holders who are choosing to make available. Peter talked about some of the limitations there. Another limitations is most of those have melted away, right? Those were for the spring only, and then they disappeared. So what we've been left with is this problem that libraries have been wrestling with for a long time, but even more so for all of the sort of health and safety reasons that we've been talking about. Our colleagues at Guelph University released this Guelph statement over the summer that articulated these are the specific, this publisher has this textbook that needs to be available. It's not available. It's not.
Mute, sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, I'll keep yammering on. So the Guelph statement did a nice job of saying like that there are these huge sets of resources that students need access that we cannot license at any price, right? Libraries would love to bend over backwards to get access to that textbook or to get access to that piece of streaming media or to get access to whatever it is. There's just not a market there in the first place. So not only can we not rely on fair use necessarily because there's this licensing market that might get in the way, but we also can't do the licensing work that we'd like to do as well. So this is the sort of double challenge there in a lot of ways. I have to say I did a webinar on this last week for an OER group, and folks got to ask questions. And literally all of the questions were some variation on this problem specifically. It was in different, contexts or in different departments or whatever, but this is the challenge that we're all wrestling with right now. And sometimes we talk about flexing those fair use muscles in a different way. But a lot of the times the words OER do start to come up eventually, and you start to say like, there is not a good way to get access to this Cengage book because it's just not available that way. But did you know that our friends at OpenStax have a book that has all the ancillary materials, was published using the same processes? It's got 5 stars in the Open Textbook Library. It's pretty good. Can we take a look at that? So I think that conversation has been happening sort of on repeat over the past few months as well. I see there's a question here as well. Yes, absolutely. And I'm happy to keep going from there. So Merida asks the question, Peter, can you talk briefly about the best practices project and then what you can do with the specific limits of education? So I've sort of laid out the problem and talked about OER as one option. I wonder, Peter, if you could talk a little bit about the way that the best practices project is sort of helping move that effort forward.
Absolutely, and with pleasure. When we got started, talking with OER makers and the librarians and system officials who assist them and give them support and guidance, we discovered something interesting, which was that although the general notion of making more OER as a way of kind of beginning to level out some of the access inequities that we've talked about before, and also, of course, especially at the college and university level, of saving students, many of whom don't have a lot of money, an enormous amount in their budgets. You know, those of us who teach or used to teach, as in my case, universities, we kind of lost track of how much the books we were assigning cost. But when I, in my final years of teaching, began to investigate that, I was horrified by the collective and individual burdens that we were imposing on our students. So when we started to talk to people about OER and OER making let me shut the window here. And sort of inquire about how copyright factored into all of that, one of the things we discovered was that OER authors were really, really reluctant to incorporate into their materials anything, any illustration, any example, any image, any clip of music and video that wasn't either clearly in the public domain or available on an open license. And that meant that OER authors were often choosing second or third best inserts, if I can use that category to describe all of these kinds of third-party materials that you might want to pull into learning materials that you're creating in order to make them better, clearer, stronger, more engaging. They were foregoing the best choices and they were making do with the second best choices. And sometimes they were simply eliminating these added value inserts altogether. And when we asked, well, why aren't you thinking about the possibility that just as an ordinary textbook author can rely on fair use, you too, as the maker of an OER or part of the team making an OER, could do the same? It was pretty clear to us that the answer was, well, because we don't have any information and we don't have any support for that way of thinking. And so we have turned some of our energy to the project of helping this community to create a guidance document about how to use fair use responsibly, safely, but effectively in the creation of OER. And we are following the model that members of our team have used before in the past in creating a whole series of so-called best practices, codes, and statements for different professional communities, filmmakers and poets and librarians and certain K through 12 teachers and people in various learned disciplines over the course of 15 years. And the reason for this, in significant part, the reason to try to do this is very much the reason that you, Will, and you, Meredith, before emphasized, and that is that OER is a potentially powerful tool for leveling, if not entirely eliminating, all sorts of disparities in educational access that existed before the pandemic, that exist during the pandemic, that will continue to exist after the pandemic. But it can't fulfill that mission it can't do its best in that direction if those who make it are unduly cautious about taking advantage of the fair use rights, because that's what they are. The Congress has said so, and we might as well echo them, the fair use rights that all of us enjoy. So we're getting there. We're pretty close, I would say, probably within weeks of having a document, which we will then try to roll out over the months to follow. And the document is going to be, in effect, a description of common recurrent situations that we have heard in our conversations with members of the community come up again and again for OER makers about the extent to which and the instances in which they can take advantage of fair use. And the document, as all of these best practices documents do, it won't set out any metrics, 5% of this or 2 bars of that or so many pixels of the other, which that's all silliness and nonsense that has no basis in law or for that matter practice. This will instead, we hope this document will instead help OER makers to embrace a common process, thinking through fair use questions from their presentation to their resolution. And it will be, if not comprehensive, then at least coextensive with the major recurrent difficulties that we have identified as coming up again and again in OER making practice. We hope it'll be of value to people in American education at all levels, from K to question mark, as far as you might want to take it. We also hope it'll have some international value, because although fair use in the US version or variant only exists perhaps in 6 or 8 other countries in the world, all countries have significant educational exemptions. Most countries have meaningful quotation rights. And there are, we think, ways in which the laws of other countries' non-fair use jurisdictions should map fairly readily onto, if not everything, then at least most of the contents of this forthcoming best practices document.
Thank you, Peter. Meredith may be wrestling with a fire alarm, so I'll sort of take the helm until she's back there.
All right,
I
I'm
think
back.
Oh, great, thank you.
We've been having rolling fire alarms in that building, which has been really great. Sorry for the interruptions. So I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to echo what Peter said, I think, which is, there is this concern in OER that because limitations and exceptions for education and limitations and exceptions for quotation don't line up exactly country to country, that including materials under fair use can somehow break the interoperability of OER. And I think that, frankly, that just concedes far too much ground, that in fact, in many countries, if you patch together what is available from fair dealing, from fair use, from specific limitations and exceptions for education and quotation, that a lot of these core purposes of teaching are, by design, are intentionally permitted. And we need to translate that from their classroom or their print contexts to a digital one. And then perhaps as a final thing, I think it is really important to problematize the places where it is not. In places where core teaching and learning activities in the digital world are not permitted by your education exceptions or by your quotation exceptions, then that should be their problem, to be a little colloquial. That needs to be a problem in the poor structure of the law that is argued about and lobbied to change, not a lowest common denominator that makes OER only as useful as the most restrictive copyright law internationally. And so in our first step of this project, we're focusing on the US. In the very short term, we're expanding to try to explain how, in fact, the same practices under a slightly different legal structure are enabled in Canada, because the US-Canada communities, I think, are the most intertwined for OER. And then in the coming 2 years, as we both work to explain and sort of socialize the best practices in the US, we're looking forward to international partnerships to document and understand how either their education and quotation exceptions do enable a core set of these practices, or to document how they don't and work to change those laws.
You're here.
We are
Absolutely.
out of time. We have 1 minute left. I would say, Will, if you have any last words, you've been a great friend to this project, and then we'll wrap up.
No, we appreciate your time and attention. There was one question in the chat about the relationship between specific exceptions and fair use. And I'll just say they hold hands and play together very, very nicely, whether you think about fair use as the safety net underneath or the wind beneath 110.1's wings or whatever. There's not only not a conflict, they're great friends.
Good point.
Thank you all. Thank you again to Charisma and to the Global Congress organizers, to the facilitators and translators on this call, and to those of you who have attended, regardless of how early or late it is where you are. Have a great morning, afternoon, and evening. And I hope you join other sessions in the Global Congress happening today and this week. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.